Yesterday, a document landed on my desk that exposes the hidden architecture of Canada's long-term economic survival strategy. It was the first ever pre-tournament economic impact assessment jointly audited by Deloitte Canada and FIFA's internal economists. On the surface, the mainstream media is treating this as a standard sports narrative, a celebration of soccer coming to Toronto and Vancouver. But if you look past the stadium gates, the numbers reveal a high-stakes, surgically precise economic detonation years in the making. We are looking at a total national injection of 3.8 billion Canadian dollars in positive economic output. Most financial commentators look at that macro figure and assume it is back-of-the-napkin hype. It is not. Deloitte's independent sports business advisory practice broke this down into three highly structured, verifiable buckets. $2 billion flowing directly into Canada's gross domestic product as net income. $1.3 billion in labour income going straight to Canadian workers, and $700 million landing in municipal, provincial and federal tax revenues. But here is the signal most analysts are completely missing. Canada is hosting only 13 matches total across its entire soil. 13 matches. When you divide that $2 billion direct GDP contribution by those 13 dates, the math becomes jaw-dropping. Every single match Canada hosts generates an average of $155 million in direct GDP. That is not multiplied economic output or speculative projection. That is direct contribution to gross domestic product per game, 13 times over. Contrast this with the United States, which is hosting 60 matches across 11 cities. While the American media focuses on sheer volume, Canada has engineered the highest job creation and GDP efficiency per individual match of any host nation globally. Every single game on Canadian soil sustains or creates 1,850 jobs nationally. That is a workforce footprint that mid-sized industrial sectors spend a decade trying to build, achieved inside a 90-minute whistle. Subscribe to Canada SR for clear, fact-driven analysis like this that exposes how capital actually moves behind official announcements. Make sure you're subscribed and hit that like button to track these shifts with us. To understand how Canada engineered this efficiency battle, we have to trace the timeline of the infrastructure investments. This was not a sequence of sudden expenditures. It was a highly calculated infrastructure play. Here is the chronological sequence to keep things clear. The timeline began years ago, with intense behind-the-scenes lobbying. But the formal structural layout solidified when the federal and provincial governments locked in capital improvement budgets. British Columbia took the lead by allocating 7 matches to Vancouver's BC Place Stadium. To meet rigid FIFA standards, the province executed a $180 million permanent renovation. They tore out the old surfaces, installed a state-of-the-art natural grass pitch, widened the playing field to exact global dimensions, overhauled the luxury hospitality suites, and completely rebuilt the internal broadcasting infrastructure. That $180 million layout was fiercely criticised at the time as an unnecessary luxury. But look at the actual yield. Those 7 matches are generating $1.7 billion in total economic output for British Columbia. That translates into $980 million directly into provincial GDP, $610 million in direct labour income for local workers, and over 13,700 preserved or created jobs. The province used international sports capital to fund a permanent 2-decade infrastructure upgrade that the city of Vancouver could not otherwise afford on a standard municipal tax base. Meanwhile, Ontario executed a parallel financial play. Toronto took 6 matches and delivered a $1.3 billion total economic output projection. The city's venue underwent a $157.9 million complete structural overhaul. The financing structure here is highly telling. The City of Toronto committed $132.9 million, while Maple Leaf Sports and Entertainment injected $25 million of private capital to bridge the gap. They expanded permanent capacity from 30,000 seats to 45,736 seats, mounted 4 massive new LED video boards, and installed a permanent 1,000-person capacity rooftop patio back in 2018. Toronto initially projected that hosting would cost the city between $30 and $45 million. When that budget ballooned into a $380 million total municipal commitment, Local critics hammered city councillors for fiscal irresponsibility. But those critics missed the fundamental rule of institutional investment. The question is never the cost, it is always the return. The Greater Toronto Area Economic Assessment confirms $940 million in direct local economic output from those 6 games alone. Spend $380 million to claw back $940 million within a single metropolitan area. That is a 2.4 times return on invested capital. No institutional investor on Bay Street would turn down that trade. That is the domestic ledger. But the deeper strategic meaning lives in the corporate travel data, which signals a massive shifting of international corporate networks. Data tracked in real time by the corporate travel platform Navan reveals that Toronto's combined hotel and flight booking spend exploded by 486% year over year. Vancouver followed with a 300% surge in overall tournament booking demand. Nationwide, cross-border corporate travel bookings jumped 295% combined. This was not a wave of leisure tourists buying cheap economy seats. This was executive travel, high-level corporate networking, sponsor activations, and multi-million-dollar client entertainment schedules. These corporate flights were booked an average of 119 days in advance. That extreme lead time reflects deliberate institutional intent. Global corporations are using these 13 matches as a massive networking sandbox, positioning Toronto as North America's premier financial and technological alternative hub. This brings us to the core thesis of Canadian sovereignty. This economic injection is not happening in a vacuum. This massive asset play is unfolding exactly as Canada faces its most severe geopolitical stress test in a generation. While the stadiums fill up, a much more dangerous game is being played in the boardrooms of Ottawa and Washington. Mark Carney's strategic trade negotiating team is currently preparing for the formal CUSMA review deadline. The official narrative from Washington focuses on regular trade stabilization. But the other half of the story is an aggressive American tariff offensive designed to reshape continental supply chains to Canada's detriment. Carney's absolute priority is protecting the foundational CUSMA exemption, which currently shields roughly 38% of all Canadian exports from punitive baseline tariffs. If Canada loses that exemption, tariff exposure will immediately cascade across almost every sector of the domestic economy. This single geopolitical reality explains Carney's calculated restraint. Publicly, he has consistently avoided personal attacks on Donald Trump, opting instead for methodical diplomatic composure. Privately, however, Canadian negotiators describe the atmosphere as highly volatile, openly referring to the American trade apparatus as a chaotic negotiation machine that shifts deadlines and alters structural demands on a weekly basis. This unpredictability is a deliberate negotiating tactic designed to induce exhaustion and force early Canadian concessions. But Canada is refusing to play the victim. Carney has spent the entire year repeating a single, unyielding line across every press briefing. Canada will not simply take notes from American instructions. That rhetorical assertiveness is backed by provincial maneuvers. Ontario launched an aggressive, multi-million-dollar anti-tariff television campaign inside the American media market, explicitly quoting Ronald Reagan's historical critiques of protectionist trade policy to shame US lawmakers. While Donald Trump reportedly called the ad campaign dishonest, escalating public tensions. Ontario defended the play as a vital pressure tactic that reached millions of American voters. Public pressure campaigns rarely alter hard trade data on their own. What actually shifts power dynamics is raw economic retaliation. Canada's counter-tariffs on American steel, aluminum, and automobiles remain firmly in place, even after Ottawa strategically dropped select retaliatory measures to match specific American exemptions following a direct, high-level phone call between national leaders. That partial de-escalation was meant to restart stalled negotiations, but it has not broken the deadlock. Sector-specific deals for steel and aluminum remain highly unlikely in the near term, meaning Canadian industrial workers will have to endure prolonged market friction as these disputes are dragged into the wider comprehensive review. Compounding this pressure is Washington's multi-front trade offensive. The American trade agenda is completely overloaded, balancing simultaneous tariff disputes involving Greenland, Russian oil, and Iranian energy compliance. Canada is forced to compete for bureaucratic bandwidth in a hyper-congested Washington environment, a dynamic that actively works against a speedy resolution. Simultaneously, a forced labour supply chain investigation targeting 60 nations unexpectedly swept Canada into its net. Canadian officials have publicly called the evidence embarrassingly thin, noting that only 50 shipments were flagged and only 2 were actually blocked over a 6-year period. Yet the strategic effect is identical. It creates an artificial layer of compliance uncertainty designed to squeeze Canadian steel, lumber, and automotive exporters simultaneously. This is an incredibly wide conflict front for a mid-sized economy to manage against a superpower. But Ottawa has countered with a massive $24 billion fiscal support package, backing work-sharing programs to preserve vulnerable industrial jobs, while Export Development Canada actively aggressively chases alternative buyers across Europe and Asia. Every percentage point of export volume shifted away from the United States reduces Canada's 76% American trade dependency, fundamentally altering long-term negotiating leverage. The formal clock starts soon, and Canadian trade advisors are frantically warning exporters that missing the upcoming September consultation window will be a catastrophic, irreversible mistake. Mainstream financial media will continue to focus on the surface-level political insults and dramatic headlines. But the real architecture of Canadian sovereignty is being decided by how successfully Canada leverages its $3.8 billion global branding showcase against the grinding protectionist machinery of American trade policy. The lines have been drawn, the capital has been deployed, and the economic survival of the nation hangs on who blinks first at the negotiating table. But the most consequential question remains unanswered. How did a mid-sized economy like Canada pull off a trade of this magnitude under the nose of a hyper-protectionist Washington? The answer lies inside the heavily guarded deal architecture of the United Joint Bid. This was not a passive real estate handout or a casual hosting agreement. It was a multi-tiered binding legal contract that weaponized international sport to shield domestic industries, to map out how this capital protection scheme actually operates. We must dissect the deep policy pillars that the negotiating teams locked into place. The architecture rests on 3 highly technical mechanisms. First, Canada integrated its venue development budgets directly into multi-decade municipal infrastructure bonds. When the City of Toronto committed $132.9 million to expand BMO Field and British Columbia injected $180 million into BC Place Stadium, they were not just paying for short-term seating expansions. The deal terms mandated that private entities like Maple Leaf Sports and Entertainment match public funds with an immediate $25 million injection. This private capital was tied to a 20-year binding operational commitment. By doing this, the state forced corporate, hospitality and media conglomerates to permanently underwrite the maintenance of these public assets, ensuring that the $940 million in regional economic output would act as a permanent shock absorber for the local tax base long after the tournament concludes. Second, the structural layout of the visitor expenditure model was designed to bypass traditional retail leakage, a common economic failure where event profits immediately flee the host country via foreign-owned hotel chains and digital platforms. The Canadian team engineered a specific regulatory sandbox for the tournament window. For instance, Airbnb's projected 61,000 incoming corporate and elite guests are expected to generate $540 million in direct GDP. This was achieved by introducing highly localized transient accommodation levies that capture up to 6% of gross transactional values at the source. This capital does not sit in overseas bank accounts. It is legally directed into municipal tourism and infrastructure funds, converting short-term consumer demand into liquid state revenue with surgical precision. Third, and most critically, the Canadian negotiating team tied these municipal upgrades directly to its larger continental trade strategy. Mark Carney's 24-member advisory committee, which packs representatives from the automotive, steel, aluminum, and agricultural sectors into the same room, quietly aligned the timing of this massive international branding showcase with the commencement of the formal CUSMA review. When Washington attempts to weaponize supply chain investigations or shift tariff deadlines to squeeze mid-sized Canadian exporters, Ottawa flashes a highly visual counter-signal. By turning Toronto and Vancouver into the absolute epicenters of global corporate networking, Canada effectively demonstrates that its major metropolitan centers possess the high-end infrastructure, capital liquidity, and sovereign stability to thrive as independent financial and tech hubs, with or without concessionary cross-border access. This structural leverage is further reinforced by an asset class that the mainstream financial press almost entirely ignores: Canada's massive pension fund investment flows. Groups like CPPIB and CDPQ hold hundreds of billions of dollars in premium American infrastructure, real estate, and utility networks. Behind closed doors, this asymmetrical capital relationship gives Canadian trade negotiators immense, quiet influence over US markets. If Washington continues to treat the trade alliance like a chaos machine, changing terms weekly to exhaust Canadian resolve, Ottawa retains the ultimate financial counterweight. They can subtly restrict or pivot future institutional capital allocations away from American projects, hitting US state-level development plans where it hurts most. This is professional, hyper-calculated economic statecraft. By generating $155 million in direct GDP contribution per individual match and maintaining the highest job creation efficiency of any host nation globally, Canada has built an unassailable domestic narrative. This soaring internal performance gives Carney the absolute political room he needs to hold the line against protectionist pressure, safely ignoring the routine political statements designed for daily news cycles while methodically preparing documentation for the critical September consultation window. The architectural trap has been set, and the billions are already flowing exactly where Ottawa intended. But as the formal July deadline approaches, the underlying systemic strains are beginning to show across the continent. Ultimately, Canada's World Cup strategy is not about hosting a tournament. It is a multi-billion-dollar sovereign defence mechanism. By locking in a 2.4 times return on municipal capital and capturing global corporate travel spending at the source, Ottawa has transformed a transient sports event into a permanent shield for domestic industry. When you zoom out to the broader strategic picture, this is the opening gambit of a completely new era in Canada-US relations. For nearly 3 decades, continental trade functioned under the assumption of seamless, rules-based integration. The pre-Trump era was defined by predictable, stable supply chains where borders were mere administrative checkpoints. Today, that old order is dead. Prime Minister Mark Carney openly acknowledged this structural rupture during his pivotal Davos address, declaring that global integration has been actively weaponized by hegemonic powers. The World Economic Forum Mesh 1. This means Canada can no longer afford to build its economic policy entirely around the goodwill of Washington. The $3.8 billion World Cup detonation serves as a physical manifestation of Canada's aggressive new diversification push. While Carney's team methodically fights to preserve the critical QSMA exemptions in bilateral talks, Export Development Canada is simultaneously executing a secondary strategy to double Canada's non-US exports over the next decade. By aggressively courting alternative buyers across Europe and Asia, Ottawa is using this tournament as a prime international staging ground to signal that Canadian critical minerals, clean tech, and advanced manufacturing are open for global business independent of American compliance whims. PBST's massive pivot fundamentally changes Canada's role within traditional global alliances. Rather than operating as a passive middle power relying on legacy frameworks, Canada is stepping forward as a primary architect of strategic autonomy. The aggressive defensive maneuvers, such as backing vulnerable domestic steel and lumber sectors with a $24 billion support package while keeping counter-tariffs firmly on the table, show that Ottawa is willing to absorb short-term friction to secure long-term sovereign leverage. The global community is watching this playbook unfold with intense scrutiny. If Canada successfully navigates this high-stakes standoff, it creates a brand new template for how middle powers can counter economic coercion from dominant trading partners worldwide. The World Economic Forum, every strategic alignment, every dollar of infrastructure spending, And every corporate flight booked 119 days in advance has led to this exact crossroads. The next critical juncture lands on July 1st, when the formal Kuzma review clock officially begins ticking. As the three stations enter a high-stakes holding pattern, the true metrics of success will not be found in the fiery rhetoric of political news cycles, but in the highly technical committee rooms during September's formal consultation windows. Canada has spent years positioning its pieces across the chessboard,